for being here. So Mike mentioned this is my 8th year speaking. I had a streak of 7 in a row. I missed last year, so I've really been waiting and looking forward to getting back to this speech on campaign finance. Because this is an election topic that rounds out really the trifecta, or in my language, the hat trick of election law topics involved in the Constitution that really form the core foundation of our electoral process. It forms the incentives, the structures, the rules of how elections occur, and the incentives, I want to emphasize incentives, that are built into that system. So what were those 3? The first one, 2 talks ago during our decennial census process, was about redistricting. And that encompasses reapportionment, how many people are in each district, how we redistrict, and the gerrymandering factors in that, how those lines are drawn for establishing the districts for how we elect our representatives. Talk 1, redistricting. 2 talks ago, which I think is the most important of the 3, and is one I might get back to later tonight because there's actually a question on our Colorado ballot that we'll see in November, which is primary election reform. And that was my last talk. And I think that's most important for some reasons that I'll get back to towards the end. I might take speaker prerogative and save a few minutes at the end to talk about the primary election reform ballot measure. It depends how I'm feeling, we're feeling, the room's feeling when we get to that. If you want to, you can ask me something about it during the question and answer period. So the third, I've been waiting to kind of round out this hat trick trifecta, is campaign finance. If you saw the title of the talk, it's Money, 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 Campaign Finance Reform and Constitutional Law. I think there's an intuitive sense that we all probably have that money is an important factor in politics, money is an important factor in government, and there's a famous, old famous quote about campaign finance that I was like, I have to squeeze this in here somehow, that says, the 2 most important things in politics are money and I can't remember what the second one is. And it's a great quote because it really encapsulates the importance of this and the influence of all this stuff. So campaign finance, it's a big issue. There's a lot of information. There's a lot to talk about. For example, what is a PAC? What is a super PAC? What's the difference between the 2? What's Citizens United? Are corporations people? Is money speech? Is speech money? What's hard money? What's soft money? What's outside money? What's dark money? What's the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission? What do they do? How are they appointed? What planet are they from? Why do all these commercials say, I'm candidate Smith and I approve this message? There's a lot that goes into campaign finance that maybe you've heard about, maybe you've seen, and maybe you've heard it talked about. But maybe you don't exactly know what a PAC, the difference between a super PAC and a PAC. You don't exactly know what the Supreme Court held in the Citizens United case. Did it actually say corporations are people? Maybe you've heard people say the Supreme Court said corporations are people. Money is speech. So you might have heard some of these things. And so I want to make sure that we're going to leave here tonight having a really a good enough understanding of these core topics, these core items in the campaign finance field, so that when you go back out into the world and you hear these things referenced, you hear them talked about, and they're going to be talked about. It's an inevitable part of the campaign process. We're in a campaign season, as you all know. You'll have a little better feel for where they came from, what they mean, and what it entails for the whole campaign process. I'm going to take a little sip of this. Anyone else have a cocktail out there? It's Grand Lake. I know we're going to form the official tailgate committee for my talk next year, but we got started a year early. So, okay, so lucky for us, a lot of these campaign finance issues all trace back to our Constitution, right? This is Constitution Week. We're going to learn a lot about our constitutional law and our constitutional system, especially the First Amendment, as we talk about this stuff. So, as I always like to do, those who know me, I'd like to say for my fans out there who know that the way I like to approach these things is to turn back the clock and look at some of the history. How did we get to where we are now? Where did this stuff come from? And there's a very rich history on campaign finance law. It dates all the way back to our founding, and there are key moments throughout our history, but our modern era of campaign finance in America really, it starts in the beginning of the 1970s. And that's where I want to start. We have limited time, right? We could talk about the 18th and 19th centuries maybe next year. So 1971, the Federal Election Campaign Act is signed into law. It's actually signed into law in 1972, but it's referred to as the 1971 Federal Election Campaign Act. It's signed by the president, who at the time was Richard Nixon. Kind of use my foreshadowing voice here, because we're going to get back to him in just a moment. That really begins our modern era. And what does the 1971 Federal Election Campaign Act do? Well, the key component of that law was disclosure and transparency. Where's campaign funding coming from? Where is it going, and what is it going? Who is it going to, and what is it going for? Now, that was a big step. It also established something called the Office of Federal Elections, the predecessor of the Federal Election Commission that we have today. And so it was a big step, but that's really all it did. And only a few years later, 1974, there was a complete overhaul of the federal campaign finance law, the 1974 amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act. That really set the foundation for the campaign finance law that we really have today, as it's been changed and interpreted by the Supreme Court and by other federal legislation. But that's the beginning. So 1971 is the first real breakthrough. And in 1974, so quickly, there is this complete overhaul, really complete revolution in the campaign finance world. So what happens between 71, 72, and 1974 that would cause this? Well, our country went through a little something called Watergate. I heard someone say it. Some of you might even remember. Early 70s, those are good times. Yeah, boy, were those good times. I remember them. So our country goes through Watergate. June 17th, 1972, 5 burglars are caught breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate Hotel and Office Complex in Washington, D.C. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg, right? What happens after that are investigations into what happened. And these investigations, they take place in the Senate Irvin Committee. There's special prosecutors from the Justice Department. You might remember some of these names: Archibald Cox, Leon Jaworski. There's federal district court in Washington, D.C. conducts court hearings, all investigating what this Watergate thing was about. And as the investigations continue, it revealed that the Watergate break-in was really just one little item that they happened to get caught. Because these weren't just second or third rate burglars, as they were referred to originally. These were men in crisp suits with sequentially numbered crisp $100 bills with them. They had spying equipment. What's going on here? And so as the investigations unfolded, they realized that the Watergate burglary was actually part of this wider pattern and network of political really sabotage and political espionage that had been going on for some years prior, and that involved a lot more people and a lot more stuff. Now, when I was doing all my reading for campaign finance, and I went through a lot of books, I brought them with me because I read them. I might as well have them on display. Lots of books and articles, always references to Watergate, and always allusions back to Watergate. So I went down the Watergate rabbit hole, and I'll tell you, it was hard to actually come back from that because it's such good stuff. It's bad stuff, but it's good stuff in an entertainment kind of a sense. And what happened with one of the core revelations of Watergate was campaign finance. And as you all know, Watergate investigations led eventually to Richard Nixon resigning in August of '74. We actually just marked the 50th anniversary of that. And it also led to 48 indictments and convictions and jail time. For example, Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell, went to jail. Special White House Attorney John Dean went to jail. You might remember some of these names: Ehrlichman, Haldeman. You might remember some of the names. So they went to jail for what they did. And what they found was that campaign finance funding was a real part of this, because how did they pay for this stuff, right? How did they pay for the burglars? How did they pay hush money for the burglars and other people? How did they pay for spying equipment, cameras, wiretaps, phone taps, lawyers, travel? all of this pay, I mean, they even had the Nixon, and I don't know if anyone remembers this, this, you remember 72, this is Nixon's re-election campaign. He in 68 defeated Humphrey. He was going up against McGovern in 72, and the committee, his committee for his re-election was called the Committee to Re-elect the President. That acronym's down to CREEP, which is really one of the great just one of the great political accidents of like all of American history. But the committee had to actually paid for these ideas and these schemes. One of which I have to mention because it's hard to believe was actually a scheme to firebomb the Brookings Institution. It's a think tank in D.C. so that they could steal documents out of their safe. And they were going to come in and pretend like they're firefighters with this old fire truck, and they ended up nixing it at the end. So they didn't actually do that, but they were up to this kind of stuff. Burglary and other kinds of spying, sabotage, political espionage. Big deal, right? So what happens after, this is Watergate. The break-ins in 72, Nixon resigns in 74, Ford eventually pardons Nixon, so that Watergate could really be put behind America and move on. Now, one of the consequences of Watergate, which is often a consequence of a big scandal like that, is confidence in our government is low, suspicion of our government is high, and that is fertile ground for reform. And so that's what happened between the 71-72 Federal Election Campaign Act and the 1974 amendments. So what did those 74 amendments do? I'm going to try to time all the sips of this drink, like really good dramatic moments of this talk tonight. So a couple big items that the 74 amendments did. One is that they limited the amount of money that could be donated directly to candidates. Okay? They limited the amount of money that could be donated to candidates. They also limited the amount of money that candidates could spend in their campaigns. And then they also, the 74 amendments also limited the amount of independent expenditures that individuals can make for the benefit of a candidate. What's an independent expenditure? Because I want to make sure we understand it's really key for how campaign finance law develops and how it works today. An independent expenditure, say I really like candidate Smith, I've never met candidate Smith, never talked to candidate Smith, never communicated, coordinated anything with candidate Smith, but I want to create and air a TV commercial that says vote for candidate Smith because candidate Smith is great for all these great reasons. The money I spend on that commercial is an independent expenditure, right? It's independent because there's no communication, no coordination between candidate Smith and myself. So independent expenditures are key. You have to remember that, okay? So the 74 amendments limit donations directly to candidates, limits what candidates and parties can spend, and limits independent expenditures. So that's 74. Almost immediately, that law is challenged in federal court. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and in 1976, the Supreme Court decides what is the landmark case in campaign finance law. You may have heard of Citizens United, and Citizens United is an important case. We're going to get to it. I'm sure you all want to, you're here for that, maybe, like that's the main event. But really, the landmark case in campaign finance law is a case called Buckley versus Vallejo that is handed down in 1976. Okay, and what does the court in Buckley say? The court does not say that money is speech. It does not say that money is speech. But the court says that in order for political speech to get out there, right, in order for it to actually mean something with who hears it, how it gets disseminated, and how it makes an impact, in order for any kind of speech to really mean anything, you have to spend money to get it out there. And so when you restrict money, you are restricting that political speech, right? Money isn't speech, but in our modern continental republic, you need money to get your political speech out there. And so when you limit money, when you limit political money, you're limiting political speech. Okay? Now, individuals have First Amendment freedom of speech rights. And First Amendment freedom of speech rights are at their highest, strongest point when we're making political speech. So the Supreme Court says, well, money is not speech. Limiting money is limiting political speech that is protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. Now, that's not the end of the story. The court says that even though limiting money limits political speech protected by the First Amendment, the government can still do that as long as it has a really, really good reason. Okay, the classic example in the First Amendment context is, Congress shall pass no law abridging the freedom of speech. That's what it says in the First Amendment. But you can't walk into a crowded theater and yell fire, right? And have everyone trample and hurt and injure each other, maybe kill each other, and get away with it saying, oh, well, freedom of speech. No, so the government can limit speech, but it has to have a really, really good reason for it. It's something in judicial review terms that's called strict scrutiny. Maybe next year we'll get into the tiers of scrutiny, Supreme Court kind of judicial review stuff, really kind of law school stuff. But this is essentially what it says. Okay, the government can restrict freedom of speech, but it has to have a really good reason. And what the Supreme Court said is the only reason, in Buckley v. Vallejo, 1976, the only reason that the government can restrict political speech money in political speech is to prevent quid pro quo corruption. Okay? That's the only reason. What is quid pro quo corruption? It's the classic, I give you money, you give me a political favor. Okay, if you're a candidate or an office holder. Quid pro quo corruption or its appearance. This is the only reason that the government can actually restrict the freedom of speech. Okay, that's still not the end of the story. Then the court says, okay, now that we've established that rule, what does that mean for these 1974 amendments? It means that when the law restricts how much money can be donated directly to candidates, that's okay, because that's the quid in the quid pro quo, right? I give you money, you give me political favors. So the restriction on the amount of donations directly to candidates, candidate committees, is permissible under the First Amendment freedom of speech doctrine set down by the Supreme Court. Now, however, that's donations. This is another important distinction. That's donations, contributions, giving directly to candidates. It's a different story when we're talking about expenditures. So the court says when you spend money as a candidate or a party, or independently, when you're spending money, you're not actually giving the quid and the quid pro quo to a candidate. So the risk of quid pro quo corruption or its appearance actually isn't there, or isn't there enough to justify the government limiting money to limit political speech. So the law limiting those independent expenditures by individuals and the law limiting expenditures by the candidate, unconstitutional, right? Does not meet that burden of it has to be a really good reason, the only good reason of which is the quid pro quo corruption. A little bit technical, but people pay a lot of money to go to law school. You're getting this stuff for free. Now, interestingly, the court in Buckley did not say anything about, it just said independent expenditures by individuals. Didn't talk about corporations and other things like that. Hinting, because that's what we're going to get to at Citizens United. But the court in Buckley, it makes this First Amendment constitutional distinction between contributions, donations, and expenditures. Okay, so that's the law in 1976 after the 74 amendments in the case of Buckley versus Vallejo. Now, what happens after that? There's a number of things that happen. The next really big landmark milestone in campaign finance development comes in 2002. But what happened, there has to be something that's going on between 76 and 2002. Of course there is. There's a lot going on. But the main thing that I want to talk about tonight is something called soft money. And what happened with how the law developed after Buckley versus Vallejo is that the restriction on contributions, donations to candidates, was really worked around by contributions that could be unlimited to parties, to political parties, that did not go directly to any candidate, or did not go directly to any candidate's campaign. Okay? So people were donating large sums of money to parties, but only this money could only go to party building things like party administration, getting the vote out, polling, certain educational things, right? But it could not go to actual electoral campaigning for candidates. That money is called hard money, right? So if you hear this term out there, hard money is the kind of money that's regulated, goes directly to candidates, it's limited, you have to file, you have to register with the Federal Elections Commission, those donations over a certain amount have to be filed, disclosed, etc. So soft money really started to take off in the 80s. It got much worse in the 90s. Congress tried to do something about it, and they weren't able to really until 2002 when they passed this landmark legislation called the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, shortened to BICRA. It's also known as the McCain-Feingold Act after the two senators who've introduced it, John McCain and Russ Feingold. There's a lot more that goes into McCain-Feingold legislation, to BICRA, and what was going on. But the soft money loophole, and there's a lot more that goes on to what was happening with the soft money. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? You know, what was the actual impact of it? But that 2002 law closed that soft money loophole. It also did a couple other big things. I'm only going to mention two of the other big things. One of which is it required that candidates, if they have a TV commercial and they pay for it, they have to actually state in there that they approve it. So just a little sidebar, you know, you see a commercial, it's like, I'm candidate Smith and I approve this message, you know? The reason they do that is because of a requirement in the 2002 Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. Okay, so next time you're at a cocktail party and something comes on the TV and says, I'm candidate Smith and I just approve this message, you're like, oh, that's from the 2002 BICRA. Yeah, I know about that. You'll be the hero of the party. Hero of the party. The last item that comes from BICRA in 2002 that I want to mention is that the 2002 law it prohibits independent expenditures by corporations and unions out of their general treasuries. Okay, and I just want to make sure we're understanding that. It prohibits corporations and unions to make independent expenditures on campaigning, electioneering communications is the legal term, out of their general treasuries. Corporations, labor unions, other organizations, they can have separate, what are called separate segregated funds, also known as just regular PACs, political action committees that are registered, and that those PACs can raise money independently from what's going on with the general treasury of the corporation, the corporation's profit and losses. But in order to raise money, people have to donate to that PAC, and the PAC is highly regulated for what money they can take and what money they can spend. But the independent expenditures, okay, are prohibited. They're saying they're prohibited from the general treasury, prohibited, not allowed to do it. Okay, so that's really the ticket, the big ticket item that leads us to Citizens United. This 2002 law gets challenged in court before Citizens United, which was 2010, but the really big main event is Citizens United. I don't want to get too caught up in the the legalese, the legal weeds. So, what happens in Citizens United? What is Citizens United? Well, first of all, it is a thing. It's a real Supreme Court case. You can read it. It's in English, sort of. It's in English. Sort of. It's a court case, but the name Citizens United comes from one of the parties, from one of the litigants. And one of the litigant is what's called a 501c4 social welfare nonprofit corporation. And the name of that 501c4 nonprofit corporation is Citizens United. I'm going to talk a little bit about what 501c4s are and some implications they have with campaign finance in a little bit. But for right now, I have to know Citizens United is a nonprofit corporation, and they spent money out of their general treasury to produce a movie. And the movie was called Hillary the Movie. And it was very critical of Hillary Clinton, this was in 2008 during the primary election season of 2008. It was very critical of Hillary Clinton, saying she's not qualified to be president, don't vote for her for these things, for all these reasons. And it wanted to air that movie. It wanted to run ads for that movie. It wanted to provide that movie on video on demand. And the corporation, Citizens United, was worried that if they did this, that they would get into trouble under this 2002 law saying that they couldn't do it. So Citizens United sued the Federal Elections Commission for a preliminary injunction, essentially asking the court for an order to say that that law as applied to Citizens United or that law just on its face is unconstitutional and that they should be allowed to air this movie. Okay. So went to the Federal District Court in the District of Columbia. They lost. They appealed straight to the Supreme Court, as they're allowed to do under that law. And the Supreme Court held arguments, and they actually scheduled for re-argument, somewhat of an unusual procedural step, asking the parties for re-argument to specifically address an issue of should they overturn certain precedent. I don't want to get too far into that because it'll take us away from really the core principle of it all. But the Supreme Court heard this argument, and it came down with the Citizens United decision in January of 2010. Okay, what did that decision say? What was Citizens United all about? Cheers, anyone? Cheers, anyone? Yeah. So Citizens United came down January 2010. It was a 5-4 decision. Majority opinion was written by Justice Anthony Kennedy, who's since retired. And what Citizens United said was, I'm going to start again with a nod, it did not say that corporations are people. You might hear out there, Citizens United, corporations are people. It did not say that corporations are people. What it said is that people have individual First Amendment rights, political speech, and that when people join together in organizations, associations, they don't lose their First Amendment freedom of speech rights. And when people come together and join organizations, associations, groups, whatever they might be, that can take on many forms. One of those forms is a corporation. One of those forms is a labor union, right? There's many other forms that people can take when they form a group or an association. And those people, when they group together, pool their resources, they do not lose their First Amendment freedom of speech rights. So, after the court decided that, essentially just apply the doctrine from Buckley from '76, which says that if you have political speech rights, right, and remember that money isn't speech, but you need money to make that political speech, so when you restrict money, you're restricting political speech. The court says that when you restrict that political speech, the only reason you can do it, the only reason the government can say, no, you cannot make that political speech, is to prevent quid pro quo corruption. And then the court says this provision that's prohibiting Citizens United, the corporation, from spending money out of their general treasury to make an independent expenditure, and it's within a certain time frame of the election, right? And it's an independent expenditure regarding a campaign, an electioneering communication it's called, right? The law prohibiting them from doing that because Citizens United is not giving money to a candidate, because they're not coordinating with a candidate, communicating with a candidate, they're just making an independent expenditure for a political speech on a campaign out of their general treasury. The law that prohibits them from making that political speech is unconstitutional. And it struck down that law. And it said that corporations and labor unions, they are permitted under the First Amendment freedom of speech rights to make independent expenditures. You cannot prohibit the amount of independent expenditures that a corporation or a labor union can make. That's what it said. Okay? That's kind of it. It traces back to Buckley, but it was a big deal. It's obviously important. And there's a big stink, right? Big stink about Citizens United after it came down. And really the whole uproar about it after it came down had to do with a worry that now all of a sudden corporations who can spend unlimited amounts of money on independent expenditures out of their general treasuries, they're just going to flood our politics, they're going to flood our campaigns and our elections with so much corporate money that the only issues that our politicians, that our government is going to care about is corporate interests and the profit motive, and just the corporations are going to dominate our politics. Now, interestingly enough, we have 14 years of experience since Citizens United was handed down in 2010. Interestingly enough, that's not actually what has happened. Okay? Now, money has certainly, there's been an uptick in money over the last 10, 15 years in our elections to extreme amounts. I mean, when we talk about campaign financing now, we have to talk about billions of dollars. Unbelievable amounts of money, okay? But it's not corporate money flooding our politics and causing a disproportionate influence so where the agenda is just corporate agenda, corporate agenda. That's not what has happened. What has happened is there is a new entity, campaign fund, this new entity in our elections that has really started to dominate. Take another little sip here. New entity. What is that new entity? Citizens United paved the way for what is called, you may have heard of it, a super PAC. Okay? Under the law, there is no term called a super PAC. A super PAC under the law is called an independent expenditure only committee. Because a super PAC, all they can do is make independent expenditures. The other thing they can do is they can raise unlimited amounts of money. Anyone can donate to a super PAC in unlimited amounts. So if I had $1 billion, I could give $1 billion to a super PAC, and that super PAC can spend that $1 billion on anything they want involved in a campaign, as long as it's an independent expenditure, as long as it's not in communication or coordination with a candidate or a party. And so you can see this new entity, okay, you can see why it's a powerful thing. Candidates, the donations you can make to candidates is limited. Donations you can make to parties and the parties' coordination, the parties can donate to candidates, it's limited, it's restricted, very low. Those numbers are very low. But super PACs, you can donate as much money as you want, and they can spend as much money as they want. The only thing they can't do is coordinate. Now, whether there is coordination, there is communication, and whether there is real true independence or not is another question, right? There are some doubts out there about it. There's some kind of backdoor ways to communicate, but the law is that those independent expenditures can be limitless, right? As long as they are independent. The other question that's still out there is, under the law, right? The only transaction that gives rise to that quid pro quo corruption risk or its appearance is direct contributions, right? So under the law, independent contributions, even if it's $100 gazillion dollars, doesn't give rise. And even a candidate knows that that $100 gazillion dollars are spent to help them get elected. Even if they know that, even if it's totally independent, the law says that that does not give rise to that kind of quid pro quo corruption. I give you money, you give me political favors. So that's what the law says. Whether that, again, that's the same kind of side question, whether that is actually true or not, it's up for debate, right? And it is debated. Now, these super PACs, they have become extremely powerful entities in our politics and in our campaigns and our elections. The reason is because they have this unlimited amount of money to raise and spend money. Okay, so where is this money coming from in the super PACs? Like I said, it's not corporations, right? In 2020, with the most recent full data we have, the data for our current election system comes in monthly, and there'll be lots analyzed and written about it after the election. In 2020, financing the 2020 election. Okay, 89% of money going to super PACs came from individuals, from mega and very small amount of mega wealthy, mega rich individual donors. Okay, not corporations. And so it's an interesting idea. These super PACs that are now spending hundreds of millions to billions of dollars are being funded overwhelmingly by mega individual donors. What does that mean? What do we know about these individual donors? One of the things we know about these individual mega wealthy donors is that they tend to be highly ideological, right? Highly partisan. And I'm talking about both sides here, right? Okay? Highly ideological, highly partisan. And so when the super PACs are funded by highly ideological, highly partisan donors, and what kind of money are they going to spend, right? Who are they going to support? What is their agenda going to revolve around? It's going to revolve around the kind of thing that highly ideological, highly partisan donors want it to. And that means supporting candidates, right? Independently, but supporting candidates who those more ideological, more partisan sources of money like and want to see elected or want to see defeated. This is especially true in the primary system, primary election system. These individual donors furthermore, are actually tend to be more partisan, more ideological than the corporations. The corporations tend to be more pragmatic, more access-oriented. They tend to donate to both parties, right? They don't want to alienate anyone. They don't want to alienate the politicians, the regulators. They don't want to alienate their customers or clients or potential customers or potential clients. So they tend to be more moderate than these individual wealthy donors. Furthermore, come on, we're in Grand Lake here, In addition, the wealthy donors tend to be more ideological and more partisan than the parties themselves. The parties themselves have built-in incentives to win legislative majorities, right? They can't do anything if they don't win legislative majorities. They have to be in power if they want to do anything. In order to do anything, they have to win legislative majorities. In order to win legislative majorities, they have to support, there has to be candidates that win elections. For candidates to win elections, they need to appeal to the most voters. The most voters in our general electorate tend to follow something of a bell curve, right? Fewer people on the farther outskirts, more people clumped in the middle. So the theory, the political science theory with empowering parties, and the natural incentive of parties is to moderate somewhat, right? They want to support, they want candidates who can win, and they want many candidates who can win so they can have legislative majorities. That's the only way that they can gain power and do anything. So the single individual ideological donors that they have just one issue they care about so much. Maybe it's environmentalism, or maybe it's gun rights or something. They just want, that's the only thing they care about. They're not interested in legislative majorities or other agenda items or compromise or whatever it is, or moderation. They are fueling they are funding the super PACs. So the super PAC, individual donors and thereby the super PACs tend to be more ideological, more partisan, more polarized than the corporations and the parties themselves. Okay, the other issue, so polarization with these super PACs is an issue. The other issue is just the amount of money, the sheer amount of money that goes into campaigning now is so high that candidates have to spend so much time fundraising. And they have to spend so much of their time fundraising that they don't have as much time to, govern. So that's a problem too. They also, because there's so much money, they do, right, or the logic of it says that they do have to really think about what they do and what they say, how it's going to affect the donors, right, the mega rich, mega wealthy donors. So that could distort somewhat their policy making or their rhetoric or their willingness to compromise or whatever it is. If they're concerned more about their wealthy donors than they are concerned about their general constituents or the general public good. So we have some problems from campaign finance, that involve money in politics and polarization. Those are really the two that I've extracted from all my research on this. Okay, it's not the whole Citizens United uproar about corporate money and corporate interests dominating everything. Okay, so what do we do about it, or what has been attempted for addressing these problems? Too much money and polarization. I'm gonna flip through the notes real quick to make sure I'm not missing anything. I haven't really used these, but okay. So I want to go through a couple reform ideas. Right? The title of this talk was Campaign Finance Reform, Constitutional Law. A couple reforms out there. One of which is involves public. Well, first of all, I want to mention also that the probability of overturning the Supreme Court cases that set those sets those rules down about quid pro quo corruption being the only legitimate government interest that can justify limitations on freedom of speech, and that independent expenditures are permissible. Those core rules would require the Supreme Court overturning its precedent. It's just not going to happen. It's the makeup of the court, the way the justices sit right now, it's just not going to happen. Maybe another generation and those laws will get tweaked. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not saying. I'm just saying those laws are those rules that come down to the Supreme Court. They're there for for the long-term, foreseeable future. Other idea people have is let's pass a constitutional amendment. Of course, an amendment to the Constitution can override anything the Supreme Court does or anything that the other branches do. But that's even harder than the Supreme Court changing its precedent. It requires 2/3 of both branches of the Congress, 3/4 of the state legislatures, and that's basically impossible, especially with a controversial issue like campaign finance. Again, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not saying. I'm just saying that's not going to happen. Constitutional amendment's not going to happen. You could also amend the Constitution with state conventions. You can bypass Congress, which is an interesting path. Maybe we'll talk about that next year, Mike. That's not really going to happen. Okay, so what are the reform ideas? Have to stay within the bounds and the parameters set by these First Amendment rules as interpreted and applied by the U.S. Supreme Court. One of the ideas is to limit or take out the loophole of dark money. Okay, I mentioned dark money in the beginning. I also mentioned something called a 501c4 social welfare nonprofit corporation. These corporations, 501c4s, they don't have to disclose their donors. They also have restrictions on what money they can spend on campaigning and politics. It has to be less than half of what they do. Right? It has to be based on some kind of social welfare thing that's not politics and campaigning. But if they have $1 billion, they can spend $499 million on campaigning and elections. And if they donated $499 million to a super PAC, that super PAC has to disclose all of its sources of funding to the Federal Election Commission, public information. When you look at it, it says, oh look, the 501c4 Americans for America, let's say it's called. Citizens United, you know. That's all it says for the source of that, all that money, which doesn't mean anything, right? Some entity called Americans for America doesn't mean anything. And when you look at who funds, where the funds for that 501c4 come from, it is not public information. So you might hear the term dark money out there. That's where it comes from. It comes from the donors that do not have to be disclosed to 501c4 nonprofit corporations that enjoy that preferential tax status under 501c4 is the section of the Internal Revenue Code where they get that name. So dark money. There's a reform effort out there to require that money to be disclosed, become transparent, have to register with the FEC, have to file it with something so we know where that money comes from. There are arguments for it, there's arguments against it. It's a reform idea. I don't want to get too far into all the arguments on all sides. I'll get a little bit into a couple of these, but a couple of reform ideas. One is to reform the FEC. The Federal Election Commission now, there's 6 people on it, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. In order for the Federal Election Commission to do anything, there needs to be one vote, at least one vote from the other party. So what does that mean? It means that it often deadlocks, and more than often deadlocks. Sometimes they don't have a quorum to do anything. It's actually proven to be a pretty weak agency, but some people say that that's a feature and not a bug. Why? Because we want some kind of bipartisanship if the Federal Election Commission, that is the federal government, is going to prosecute or investigate some electoral activity, right? If you didn't need a vote from the other party, then what would happen? You know, you'd have, well, if there are 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans, you'd have more Republicans being investigated or prosecuted. If it was the other way around, you'd have more Democrats being prosecuted. Right now, the way it goes is there's 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, there's a violation or potential prosecution against a Democrat, guess what? The 3 Democrats vote no, the 3 Republicans vote yes, there's no majority, nothing happens. So whether it's a feature, whether it's a bug, and this is true for both sides, you know, that remains, you know, to be debated, but it is a reform idea out there. Okay, a couple other things that are interesting involve public funding. What I didn't really know much about until I started digging into this topic was that starting in the 70s and actually going up to 2008, there was public funding available for presidential candidates. There still is public funding available for presidential candidates and for certain state and localities. And what that means, full public funding, and what that meant is that presidential candidates wouldn't have to raise money. They could opt in to the public funding program, get money from the federal government, and use that money to spend it on their campaigning, as long as they voluntarily waive their First Amendment rights to do other kinds of fundraising and other kinds of financial spending. And this was actually used. 2008 was the last year that it was used by any major party candidate in a general election. But we had public presidential funding, which is interesting. And if you look on your IRS tax return, there's a box you can check that says, you know, I want to give $1 or $3, or maybe it's up to $5 or $6 now. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but you know, a couple dollars out of your tax return to go into the presidential election public fund. Nobody's using it since 2008 because they can raise so much more money outside of this program. And so it has been somewhat obsolete, but it's an interesting idea. The benefits, well, candidates wouldn't have to spend so much time fundraising. They wouldn't be beholden to their wealthy donors. You could take that out of play. The downside is, who really likes the idea of taxpayer money going to candidates to run their election? You know, it's a little bit, you know, something about that, you know, doesn't sit great with everyone, which is understandable. The other thing is it has to be a big boatload of money in order for candidates to want to opt in. which hasn't happened again since 2008. But as recent as 2008, you had this happening, which is interesting stuff. I didn't know this. Another public funding idea involves not full funding, but partial funding, matching small donor donations. Brings a couple ideas into play. One of which is that the taxpayer money is not funding everything, but for every small donation a candidate gets, say I'm running for office and I have 100, 200, say 1,000 people give me $250, the government would match those funds and give me $250 for every small donation I made. Or in some locations at the local level, they'll do it with a ratio. If I get these small donations, say $250, the government will give me 3 times that, $750. Or in New York City, they do it, I think it's 5 or 6 times the amount of those small money donations the government will match. The idea, again, is you take that big donor problem out of play, that time consumption problem out of play, and you also, with the small donation matching, you really encourage candidates to reach out to and appeal to a lot more donors, right? A lot more donors, a lot less money from a lot more donors instead of a lot more money from a few mega wealthy donors. Kind of an interesting idea. There are downsides to that. There's a lot of research out there recently that say that small donors happen to be even more partisan, even more polarized than large donors. And the research that says that is because if a small donor, right, who isn't mega wealthy, they have a lot less money lying around to just spend on politics, right? Hard to earn money, we don't have a lot of it. There's a million other things I want to spend that money on than giving it to a politician, right? But the small donors that do that tend to be the ones that are just they're so hardcore about their politics that they're willing to give up their limited amount of money to a candidate. So that tends to fuel, there's good research, a lot of research recently that shows that those small donors tend to polarize, they tend to fuel polarization along with the large donor problem. So again, advantages and disadvantages. One other example is in Seattle, they started doing a voucher program. I know not a lot of people are like, Seattle, look at Seattle, what they're doing. But Seattle has implemented I think it was 1 election cycle ago, maybe it was 2, a voucher program for their local elections where all eligible voters get vouchers from the government, from the city government, and those vouchers, the eligible voters can then donate to candidates. And then the candidates can turn those vouchers in for actual money for their campaigns. Again, they have to opt into this. But it's an interesting idea because it's not requiring people to spend their own money. They're actually just getting these vouchers and it shows which candidates you support. And it's at a small level, so it's candidates appealing to a lot of people with a lot of vouchers. The way that has worked out really so far is hard to tell because it's so new. One of the problems with it is that local city elections people tend to not really pay attention to until it's really close to the election. So you have people giving vouchers in like a few days before or the week of or something, and by the time that gets translated to actual money and to actually doing something with it, it's really too late. So that has been an issue with it. But again, that's something that the more people know about it, learn about it, maybe the more they'll use it more in advance, and maybe it will have some kind of a advantage. And positive impact. One of the interesting things, one of the great things about our federalism system of government is that the states, and by extension the states' localities, can experiment with these things, right? To quote Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, the states in our federalism system are laboratories of democracy. That means they can experiment these different ideas, these different systems. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out, unintended or unforeseen implications of it, but it's a good idea, it's a beneficial idea to allow states and localities to experiment with this stuff instead of just one uniform rule at the federal level, and then see what happens. If it works, then other states, other cities can copy it. If it doesn't work, they won't, or they find out what's good and bad about it, they can tweak it, and it's one of the beauties of our federalism system. Now, the last reform measure I want to talk about involves the political parties, and really what you might be able to tell by this point is what I care really most about with this stuff is polarization. I'm going to pause. That's the last one, I promise. Sagebrush is calling, and we must go. What's that John Muir quote, Dan? The mountains are calling. Sagebrush is calling. So, what's this last reform effort? This last reform idea involves actually empowering the parties, political parties, vis-a-vis the super PACs. As I mentioned, the super PACs have become these extraordinarily powerful, influential entities, forces in our campaigns and in our elections and therefore in our politics. And so the idea of empowering the parties, which should, again, that political science theory, the parties should have that moderating influence, incentive, because they need to win legislative majorities, they need to appeal to those voters. And if we empower the parties with new funding rules vis-a-vis the super PACs, that should help mitigate the polarizing influence, the polarizing effects of the super PACs. So what does that mean, empowering the parties? Well, as we know, you can make a law restricting the amount of money you give to a candidate or to a party, but you don't need to do that, right? You don't need to limit the amount of money that a party donates to a candidate or a party spends in coordination with a candidate. So one of the ideas is to actually raise or eliminate the limits on parties giving directly to candidates or parties spending on behalf of candidates. Right now, the amount that parties can give to candidates or spend on their behalf is very low. And so I happen to like this idea. As long as it's coupled with keeping the restrictions on how much can be donated directly to a party somewhat low. We want to keep that somewhat low because if we eliminate or make too high the allowable amounts to donate directly to the parties, then you're going to have that same ultra wealthy, ultra mega donor problem that exists with the super PACs just translated to the parties. And they're going to be they're going to be more beholden to those super wealthy donors. But if you keep those amounts somewhat low, but then raise the amount that the parties can give to candidates or spend on the candidates' behalf, you'll get that moderating, right? The idea is you'll get that moderating influence from the parties, at least vis-a-vis, that is, at least in relation to the polarizing influence, the polarizing forces of the super PACs. It's an idea that I think is worth exploring. There actually has been some increase in the amount of contribution limits that parties can make directly to candidates or on their behalf. And I would like to see that just tried a little bit more. Again, in our federalism system, this can be experimented with at the state level, the local level. It can be experimented at the federal level, even because it's legislation, we can change it. But it's an idea that I think would counteract the worst problem in our politics, which is polarization. I'm worried about corruption. The idea of someone giving $1 million to a candidate or an incumbent and that politician giving them a political favor is disgusting. But there are laws against that, or there are criminal laws against that, and we don't want that in our politics. We also don't want our politicians spending more time on fundraising than on governing. We don't want our politicians worrying more about the interests of the mega wealthy than the interests of the general constituents or the general populace. We don't want that, but the real problem, the real source of dysfunction in our politics and our elections, to me, is polarization more than it is those other things. We can keep an eye on that stuff with disclosure, transparency, criminal law, and other kinds of restrictions. But it's the polarization problem that I really see as the real evil in this system. And you hear, threat. This person, this thing is a threat to our democracy. Oh, that person, thing is a threat to our democracy. Right? Both sides say it. Both sides really run with it and try to use it to help their electoral outlook and outcomes. But the fact is, from my perspective, that polarization from both sides, that's really the risk, the threat to democracy. And so ways that we can change the polarizing influences in our politics, I think, are the most important to me. Now, I mentioned that campaign finance is one of the three subject matters that really inform, in many ways, the core structure of our elections. The others being redistricting and primary election reform. The primary election reform portion of it is going to be on our ballot in Colorado this November. And I just want to mention it real quick before I wrap up and open this up for question and answer. But our ballots in Colorado, for all of us who are Coloradans, we're going to have a question on our ballot that asks us if we want to completely overhaul our primary election system in our state. And what it asks is if we want to eliminate partisan primaries and instead have non-partisan primaries. So instead of a primary election determining a party's nominee, the primary election would just take a large candidate pool and winnow it down to a smaller candidate pool of 4 people. So it's it would be the top 4 in that primary election process would move on to the general election, and then that general election would be determined by a majority winner instead of a plurality winner, meaning that it's not who wins the most votes, it's who can win a majority. And so if there is no majority out of those top 4, then the last place candidate would drop out, and the people who voted for that last place candidate first, their second place preference would then be redistributed to the other 3. If there was a majority then it would be over. If not, you do the same thing. So when you cast a ballot in the general election, you'll actually rank your preferences. You might have heard this called ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting. It's an interesting new idea, but it's something I wanted to bring up because I talked about it for like a couple hours in my last talk, and now here it is in Colorado. It's been implemented already in Alaska. There's some other states, a handful of other states that have it on the ballot this year. It goes to problems of polarization from what I see of it, but it's also a very new thing. It's also, in some ways, because it's new and different, it can be a complicated thing, just wrapping our minds around how that works. So I'm happy to answer some questions about that as well, because we all need to be ready for what that means and what we think that's going to entail when we cast our ballots in November. I'll also be on KFFR on October 9th talking about it, if anyone wants to tune in. I forget what time. KFFR, by the way, Grand County local radio. Great program. Great stuff. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with that. I'm going to open the floor to question and answer. There's a lot that goes into campaign finance, history, campaign finance, law, constitutional, Supreme Court cases regarding this stuff that I've touched on, stuff that I haven't. I've tried to simplify things as much as possible and get to some core central elements of this history, of this process, and also of where we stand now with ideas of the problems and ideas for reforms. What's good, what's bad, kind of a different story. I like to just kind of present these topics and these issues and both sides of it. So I'm happy to talk more about any of that stuff that we've covered or our ballot measure. And I think I'll wrap up with that, with a final cheers. I saw some